We had Joan Wood here last week. She was supposed to be here this week, but she double booked somewhere else for today. And so she called me at the last minute and said, can I come? What was last week. I hope you enjoyed her. She's a really nice person. If you didn't hear her sermon, you can look for it online. Let's see here, PowerPoint. There we go. Priscilla, let me ask you a question. Back in the Stone Age, when I first came here, did the former pastor wear a robe? I thought he probably did because I showed up with regular clothes, and Frank Keller, some of you know him. He's passed on now. He said, we got to get you a robe. And I said, no. Well, the choir had robes. I remember they came in from downstairs. They marched up the stairs. They came down, and there were seats over here, and they sang the same darn song every week. I forgot what it was, but same one every week. They all had their choir robes on, and it was a pretty fancy situation. Yeah, that was before you came, Keith. This is like they disappeared.
When I was 5 years old, I couldn't wait to get to one of those robes. I couldn't wait to get rid of them. I think I gave them away.
We had the important people chairs up here. There was one chair in the center, which was for the pastor, and then for the worship leaders, whoever led the singing. There were two pulpits. One person led the singing from one pulpit, and one person preached from the other pulpit. And so those were the for the poobahs, for the people. Were they? Yeah, they're in the office. If you want to sit, come over for some counseling, and you can sit in those chairs in my office. Reading from Luke chapter 20, verse number 45. And while all the people were listening, he said to the disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the places of honor at the banquets, who devour widows' houses and for an appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. And he looked up, and he saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put more in than all of them. For they out of all their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, as for these things you are looking at, the days will come which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down. Our context of the message this morning is just prior to the time where Jesus had the Passover meal with his disciples just before he died. This is only a few days before his death, before his murder, and he comes in and he insults the people with the robes on, the important people. Now, he doesn't insult all of them, but he insults those who have the wrong attitude. And I don't know how he knew which ones had the wrong attitude, but there certainly were some who had good attitudes, but mostly they were fakers. I can remember, yeah, that's good slide. I remember years ago at another church, this guy walked in. It was a Pentecostal church. And this guy walks in with a Roman clerical collar on. Is that better? A Roman clerical collar on. And black shirt. I mean, he looked like a Catholic priest, but he was anything but. So, I'm just trying to find out where I should go. Well, number one, a Catholic priest is not coming to a Pentecostal church to find out where he's going. And I said to him right to his face, liar. And it turns out that he went to one of the people in the church who had a business and went down and robbed them that week. He was a pretender. There are a lot of pretenders. There are a lot of pretenders on the TV. There are a lot of pretenders on the radio. There have always been a lot of pretenders. That's really close to my mouth there. So Jesus comes in and he insults the pretenders. Now, there's a huge crowd there at Passover time because the law says that everybody has to go 3 times a year to the temple and do the 3-week vacation. This is the first one of the year. They would go to Jerusalem. They would eat unleavened bread for 7 days. They would eat a Passover meal, and this is exactly what happened. This is where Jesus instituted the Eucharist, the communion. The communion is only a little teeny part of the Passover meal. Maybe we'll do a Passover meal this year. Would you like to do one? We haven't done one in many years. There's 4 glasses of wine. This is why it's the favorite Jewish holiday. And the 3rd glass is the glass of redemption. And that's the one where Jesus broke the bread and offered them the 3rd glass, the glass of redemption. And so here he is a couple of days prior to the Passover, maybe even a day before, and he is insulting the Pharisees, the leaders, the scribes, and he sees a widow giving money. Now I want to put these all together because if you look at this whole passage, it goes together, because really it's coming to a point, which was the last verse I read, where Jesus says, this temple will be torn down. And Jesus had said this a number of different times to people. He said, tear down this temple and I'll raise it up in 3 days. And he was talking about his body. And they said, Herod built this temple for 42 years. How are you going to raise it up in 3 days? How are you going to tear it down? And so he was not speaking of the literal temple, but he was speaking of the spiritual temple, which was his body and the people of God, the church of God. And so during this time, he sees these uppity people with their fancy clothes on, and at the same time, he sees this widow. Now, in the law of Moses, which is like at least 1,800 years before the time of Jesus, there was a law that says you shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry, and my wrath will burn. And I didn't even want to put the rest of the verse in because it says you will become a widow and you will become an orphan if you mistreat the helpless among you. The New Testament takes it and it changes it a little bit, and it adds religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for the orphans and widows in their distress, to keep oneself unstained by the world. So the Old Testament says don't harm them. The New Testament says help them. It takes it to that next step. And then it also says if you want to be right, you can't be an impure person. You have to keep yourself unstained by the world. Those of you may know that I totaled my car a few weeks ago, and fortunately I was able to buy another one, which is even better. It's in better shape. And there's a car cover came with it. I already have a car cover. So I thought, I'm going to sell this car cover. And I looked it up, and they're $150 new, and I thought, well, can I get $50 for it? And I'm thinking, and I'm asking Sean about it, and I pulled it out, and there's a big stain on it. Nobody will want to buy that. So we have to keep ourselves unstained. If we're going to be religious people, we can't be doing things that are forbidden in the Scriptures. So I just wanted to give you that as a little background to what we're saying. So he says, beware of the scribes. Which ones? Those who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, to have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. Now, as I looked at the word scribes, I found that almost always in the New Testament, with three exceptions, but almost always, there's dozens of mentions of the scribes, and it's always in the narrative. The scribes and Pharisees did this. The scribes and Pharisees did that. So for the most part, except for a couple of times when Jesus spoke specifically to a scribe, it's just put in the narrative. There's not much about them in the mouth of Jesus, but there's a lot about them in the narrative of the people who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the word means, the Greek word is grammateus. Do you know any English word that might be similar to that? Grammar, exactly. These are educated people. They are people who basically their job is to sit down with one version of Matthew, and they get their scroll, they get their pen out, and they dip their pen in the ink, and they make a copy of what they're looking for, and they count the number of letters in one line, and they count the number of letters in the next line, and they make a copy of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or whatever biblical book, or whatever Old Testament book they were working on. They were copyists. And so therefore, they basically knew the scriptures better than anybody, except for Jesus, because they still made some mistakes in their interpretation of the scriptures. And so Jesus has issues with scribes and Pharisees because the scribes think that they're smarter than Jesus, but they are not smarter than Jesus in every case. However, there are some good ones. In fact, Jesus said, "Every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." I don't know what you think, but I think that understanding the Old Testament is more important than understanding the New Testament. Because every idea that Jesus had was not original. It was from the Old Testament. And the arguments that Jesus had with these scribes and Pharisees were not about whether the Bible was the Word of God. The argument was how do we interpret the Word of God? And so they would sit together, and the Pharisees and the scribes and the rabbis, they would discuss things and they would come to some sort of understanding. And if you look at the Jewish writings, you see Rabbi Akiba says this, but Rabbi Hillel says this, and Rabbi somebody else says this. They're all looking at the same verse, and they're saying, well, this is how you should interpret it. And a lot of times they didn't interpret things correctly because Jesus had to correct them. And so here's one of the instances here in Matthew chapter 13 where it says, every scribe who's been trained for the kingdom is like a master of a household. So to understand the New Testament, you really have to have some knowledge of the Old Testament. I met a doctor, he had 2 doctorates, I was very proud of it one time, and he had just the New Testament. And he said, if it's not in the New Testament, you don't have to pay attention to it. What? It's in the Bible. The New Testament interprets the Old Testament. And so Jesus understood this, that there are actually some scribes who become believers, and they're able to take the treasure of old and new and put them together in a way that people can understand it. So when he says, beware of the scribes, he doesn't say beware of every single scribe. He says, beware of scribes who like to flaunt it. Beware of that. Matthew records additional information about this event. And this will surprise some of you probably. You got to click that one twice. This is in the same context because the idea of the long robes and all that stuff, the best seats, is in this. I didn't put it in here because we don't have all day to talk about this. You're not to be called a rabbi. You know, Henry always calls me rabbi. He's a Jewish guy. Rabbi, how are you? Actually, he would say it in Yiddish, the Yiddish word for rabbi. Jesus said, you're not to be called rabbi. You have one teacher. You are all students. Call no one your father on earth. What? Everybody calls their priest father. Jesus said not to do that. Now, I'm not condemning everybody that goes by the title father, but what I'm saying is that Jesus didn't want people to take their title to be, a point of pride. You're not to be called instructors. I think it says teachers in some of those things. For you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you shall be your servant. So, I don't wear a clerical collar. I've never had a clerical collar in my life. I've never worn a robe except the 2 times that I graduated from seminary. When I got my master's and my doctorate, I wore my robe, and I'm going to show you a picture of that. I thought about putting it on, but then I thought, that'll take your mind to a different place. Don't be called special. We're middle-class people, most of us, and maybe some upper-middle-class people. We ought to dress like middle-class people. People shouldn't look at the leaders in the church and say, oh, they've got a robe, they're holy, because the robe doesn't do a thing. It can mean something, but it doesn't necessarily mean something. So here's my picture. I said, I don't know if you can really see it. You can't really too well, but it's got the 3 bars on the side. Ooh. He must be pretty smart. 14 years of study to come to that, to get those 3 bars. And there was a guy standing next to me when they handed these robes out. He was a Presbyterian. And the people that were handing them out said, you've earned it, wear it. So I turned to the guy next to me, and I said, are you going to wear this in church tomorrow? And he said, no, I'm getting a good one. Yeah, the sheriff has 4 stars. The undersheriff has 3 stars. The chief has a white helmet. Do they have extra bars on their arms too? There's all kinds. The military, you can tell what the rank is if you know what the ranks are based on what's on the sleeve and what's on the collar. It's good because it tells rank, but when you're talking about Christianity, rank is not a thing, or it shouldn't be a thing. Anyway, so there's my robe. I didn't wear it. The red on my collar, that means I have a theology degree. They devour widows' houses, and for a pretense, say long prayers. You know why I don't say the prayer? Last week, Joan Wood said to me, well, when you lead the service, I said, I don't lead the service. I'm no good at it. I'm no good at saying long prayers either. If you want to hear a good prayer from me, it's a prayer that I have taken time at home and written out, and I stand up and read it, because I don't have the ability to do an extemporaneous prayer. But these people, their thing is, I'm going to pretend that I'm holier than anybody else, and I'm going to say this long, fluent prayer, and people are going to respect my spirituality. And Jesus was against that kind of stuff. And it says, they will receive the greater condemnation. Actually, James said the same thing. Not many of you should become teachers, brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. It depends on how much you know. If you know more and you do something you shouldn't be doing, it's going to be worse for you than somebody that doesn't know that it was wrong. And the pride of the whole thing is not good. And Jesus said, those who are going to be the greatest among us are going to be the servants of all. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the temple, because this occurred in the temple when Jesus was there just before he gave his life. And in comes a widow woman. Now, there is some thought that women in the New Testament had nothing and everything belonged to their husband. That's not true. Way back at the time of Moses, that's the way it was. And these daughters of a deceased guy came to Moses and said, hey, we don't have any brothers. We want the inheritance to come to us. And Moses went to God, and God said to Moses, these women are right. They need to inherit their father's stuff just as if they were a man. That's the way Judaism had always been. And you can find several examples of widows in the Old Testament who had property. Some of them were rich, some of them were poor. You know, just like there are some rich people and some poor people, and there are some middle-class people, women were able to own property. But this particular woman was poor. And she came in to the court of women. Now understand that this temple, this New Testament temple, is not the same as the Old Testament temple. I've showed you pictures of the Old Testament temple diagrams. This was a huge building with a wall around it that was 1,000 feet wide and 1,500 feet long. And then within it was the temple. So this was a major building. It had been built for many, many years with government money. And so there was an area which was the Gentiles' court where the non-Jews could come and say their prayers. And then there was the court of women, which is where the treasury was. And they had a box on the wall just like we do. Sometimes people come, don't you take an offering? Yes, we do. We take an offering. It's in the back. It's in the. You know why we still do it after COVID? They said at COVID, we don't want to handle the money. We don't want people passing the plate in front of. We might get sick. All that stuff. So we put the box in, and the people put more money in the box than when we passed the plate. So we left it up, kept doing it that way. Works better. Very pragmatic. But that's the way it was. They had a box, and there was a law. Let's see if I can find it on the next slide. Yeah. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib. That's the first month. It corresponds with the of March and April in our year. You came out of Egypt. No one shall appear before me empty-handed. So no matter how poor you were, when you came to be obedient to the law and to have the Passover meal, you had to bring something. And the rabbis had a big discussion on how much is the minimal offering you could bring. And they decided 2 mites. You know, mites are kind of small. You know, they live under your mattress, and they get in your nose if you don't clean up your room often enough. It's really small amount, and that's what she had, two mites. Now, the temple cannot operate without money. I had a discussion with one of the people in the fire department who was at the wedding. And he said, how does the church pay you? You know what I'm talking about. How do they pay their bills? You know, because the fire department gets money from this and from that, and grants and from town and from boot drive, which is coming up soon, by the way. And they're raising money in all kinds of different ways, and they have a huge budget. We don't have a huge budget. But the church and the temple, they do need money. And so I don't like to talk about money except when it comes up, and here it is. And there are rich people putting money in, and he's not condemning the rich people for putting the money in. In fact, with the rich people, it can't operate. Cannot operate on 2 mites. Just can't. Let's take a look here. In Mark, he gives us this little tidbit. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched. Can you imagine? Come into church and sit right here, and when you come in, I'm going to watch and see what you put in that box. I didn't see you put anything in there. Can you imagine Jesus doing that? He was a pretty observant guy. He's sitting there and he's watching. Now, that's one of the things that my mother told me when I was like 3. God is watching you. And Jesus is watching you. And so he sits down and he observes. And many rich people put a lot of money in, which is good. They need that. But then this lady comes in, this poor widow. She puts in 2 small copper coins. Now, you have to understand that in those days, that people who worked all day for a denarius. And those of you who are old enough to remember 1964, remember when the coinage in the United States was 90% silver. In those days, it was worth 18 cents. Now that's about today's value of about $5. 18 cents in 1960 is inflated to $5 today. So they worked for 18 cents a day, and then this woman had 2 mites, which were 1/40th of a denarius. So, people won't even pick up pennies anymore. I've seen young people, there's pennies on the ground, walk right over them because you can't buy anything for a penny. You could buy a penny candy when I was a kid. You could buy a full Hershey bar for 5 cents when I was a kid. 5 cents. A gumball you could buy for a penny. Bubble gum you could buy for a penny. So this is less than 2 cents that she put in. Now, this is at no extra charge, but in India, they have a coin which was, I think it was 1/100th of a rupee. I don't know what it is anymore. Last time I was in India, it was 40 rupees to the dollar. It's probably 80 rupees to the dollar today. And they had these coins that were 1/100th of a rupee. And they were called a dam. And so when they said, it's not worth a dam, they're not swearing. They're saying that it isn't even worth the smallest Indian coin that there is. And so this lady shows up. She doesn't have anything else in life. And she drops her 2 cents in because that was the minimum that they would allow somebody to come to worship at the temple at Passover time. And she dropped it in, and Jesus looked and said, percentage-wise, she gave more than anybody else, even though her little teeny bit doesn't help. She gave out of everything that she had. Everybody else tossed in extra, which of course is necessary. Well, how do we know that, or how did Jesus know that this woman has put in more than all of them? Well, maybe he was just assuming. I think he had some inclination from God in some way, I think. Excuse me. Didn't mean to burp in the middle of he. She's put in more than all of them. How did he know? How did he know she was a widow? Status is and has been defined by clothing forever. If you look at pictures, say in the 1800s, where if a man was widowed, he would go around town with a black band on his arm. You ever see a picture of a guy doing that? Even in ancient times, even before Moses, if a woman was a widow, she wore widow's clothes, black clothes. So she shows up in widow's clothes, and she's right. And the scribe shows up in a fancy robe, got lots of money to put in, and he's not right. It has to do with heart attitude. And to be a great one in the kingdom means to be the servant of all. Jesus, we want to be on your right hand and on your left hand in your glory. Oh, you do you? Of course, Mom was putting them up to it. You know, moms always want their kids to get the best position. I could tell you a Jewish joke. Maybe I will. The Jewish mother had a son that became the president of the United States. She says, how about my boy? The other woman says, my son's a doctor. You don't get it? They always talk. My daughter has to marry a lawyer. My daughter married an engineer. You know, their kids always have to be in the proper place. And James and John, the mother came, well, I want you to elevate my kids to your right hand and to your left. And Jesus said, you don't even know what you're asking for. To be on my right and on my left is for those who it's been prepared for. A repentant thief and an unrepentant thief. One of them says to Jesus, have mercy on me. And Jesus says, today you'll be in paradise. And the other is unrepentant. They're on the right and on the left. Nobody becomes more of a servant ever in the history of the world than Jesus became a servant, because he became a servant to die for everybody who will be repentant. So he went on and he said, all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all that she had to live on. What strikes you about this? I'll wait.
Could you imagine if we all had to wear something outwardly to let the people in our lives or
Have you seen the Amish?
no, but I mean as far as like sins we've done.
Oh,
You know, I mean you think about
the Scarlet Letter? Yeah. Thank God that's not a thing. Anymore?
I was interrupting your service to talk to Matt, but I purposely don't wear my white coat when I'm at work. So even though I've earned my white coat, I don't wear it because I don't want my patients to think that I think I'm better than them.
That's exactly why I wear regular clothes.
I think you hit it right on the head when you said God knows. He knows our heart. He knows what we treasure. He knows what we prioritize. And there's no hiding that.
Not from God.
Not from God. And, I think that in all things we should be looking at our heart and giving of time, talents, finances. God's given everybody a gift. And depending on that gift, in the end, we'll be judged on, what we did with our time, our talents.
Some
and our
people have more
finances.
time than they have money, and some people have more money than they have time.
Right.
And so both.
Now, Chris.
Some things should not be mentioned. So, after this whole discourse, Jesus, he speaks to his disciples in the hearing of everybody. And they're amazed at the beauty of the temple, and they're amazed at the people that are putting all this money in the temple. Jesus is amazed of the woman that is putting in the 2 small coins. And then he says, "Do you see these stones? They'll all be torn down." And that prophecy was fulfilled less than 40 years later. The Romans came in and tore the temple down and tore the wall of Jerusalem down. And the only thing that remains is the Wailing Wall, where the Jews go and they stick their prayer request in between those big stones and they do their prayer like this. Well, Jesus said all the stones would be torn down. Well, what about the Wailing Wall? That's not torn down. So are they going to tear it down? I don't know, but could be. Starting next week is a very interesting series of verses about the end times. What Jesus said about the last days. And I would advise, if you're interested in this, that you read ahead. Read chapter 21 ahead. We'll spend several weeks in it, and we'll talk about world events and stuff. This is somewhat theoretical. But, what do these say? They asked Jesus 3 questions. When will this be torn down? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so I think you'll be interested in this. So read ahead. And I'll give you, next week when you come, I'll give you a sheet that you can fill out so you can remember what was said. And I look forward to that. It's one of my favorite topics, actually. Anyone else? Go in peace.